something from early childhood gets repeated. It gets what we call reenacted. For these individuals, for the covert narcissist, the world becomes their caregiver, and they want one thing and one thing only. What is that? What do they want? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. This is part 2 of our 2-part series on covert narcissism. I would like to get right into the tools and techniques that I find most valuable when in a relationship with someone who exhibits covert narcissistic traits. If you have not yet listened to episode 37, you may want to consider listening to that episode first, because in that episode, we covered the foundations of covert narcissism. In episode 37, we discussed the common recommendations for dealing with a covert narcissist, such as establishing boundaries, keeping conversations brief, and counteracting gaslighting. While these suggestions are often touted in social media, I highlighted their limitations and potential drawbacks. For instance, enforcing boundaries is helpful if you're trying to protect yourself from physical abuse or overt aggression, but may not foster a deeper relational connection. Keeping conversations brief can prevent manipulative dialogues, but they also limit meaningful communication. We also explored the pitfalls of techniques like documenting events and maintaining a list of grievances, which can erode trust and intimacy in a relationship. Recognizing these limitations is crucial for assessing their effectiveness and considering alternative approaches, which we'll discuss today. Furthermore, I emphasized the paradoxical nature of these recommendations, hinting at the possibility that there are similarities between these tools and techniques and narcissistic characteristics. In other words, I was implying that one who implements these tools actually mimic the narcissistic characteristics, as if this is like a narcissistic move in and of itself. But more about that in the prior episode. Again, if you have the time, I recommend you check that out now. We then identified the defining characteristics of covert narcissism, such as hypersensitivity to criticism, subtle manipulation, victim mentality, and hidden grandiosity. To understand the origins of these traits, we briefly examine the psychoanalytic theory of the separation individuation process by Margaret Mahler, which explains how early emotional misalignment with a caregiver can lead to a vulnerable self and a lifelong quest for reunion with a nurturing figure. Yes, and I put emphasis on reunion because this is going to be the critical piece when it comes to effective, or what I find to be, and the research finds to be, effective tools and techniques. Having laid down and now quickly reviewed this important foundation, we are now ready to explore practical strategies and therapeutic approaches that can help you effectively navigate and maintain relationships with covert narcissists. Let's return to the clinical example I gave in part 1 of the wife who felt criticized, judged, and victimized when I attempted to slow her down and engage her curiosity as I wondered what she imagined. In other words, what sort of impact the labels she was using to describe her husband's behavior may have on him. She only wanted to show me how destructive his behavior was, and then she felt ganged up on and blamed. That's an example of the victim mentality that I discussed earlier and in that prior episode. She shifted the focus away from her actions and towards eliciting sympathy for herself. This kind of scenario is very common. I saw this really telling video recently. I'm not sure if this video was taken from a TV show, but it was about this woman who insisted on her view as the victim. In short, She was complaining to her boyfriend about the pressure she was experiencing and how she could feel it in her head. Then the camera pulls away, so it sort of widens the scope, and it shows that she has a nail in her head. This was brilliant, by the way, because when he tried to tell her that it may be the nail in your head that's creating that pressure, she insisted that it is not about the nail, got annoyed with him, and accused him of always trying to fix things when all she needs is someone to listen to her. For those of you who have ever encountered this kind of situation or patient, you know this undoubtedly is a challenging situation. What do you do? It was recommended that if the complaints are not about you, again, this is the video I was watching, if the complaints are not about you, it is best to maintain a compassionate but cautious distance. You can acknowledge her feelings without necessarily agreeing with them. And that part is very valuable. And we have to build on this, right? That you can acknowledge her feelings without agreeing. For those of you who have listened to prior episodes, you may have heard me, I say this quite a bit, appreciate the subjectively useful component of a maladaptive symptom. In other words, get close to it. Now, this is different, I understand. This is not taking a cautious distance. And again, that's not the way, if you're interested in maintaining or developing a relationship with somebody in your life who has these covert narcissistic characteristics, creating a distance is not going to do that. So in the video, it is suggested that you can say something like, I hear what you are saying. Tell me more about that. It sounds like this is really hard for you. Now, the tell me more is a critical piece. I'll loop back to this in a moment. But I want to just finish with this video that I was watching because it gets better. So at this point in the video, they cut back to this film that I was just describing to you. It's like a clip maybe of something that was on TV with this woman with the nail in her head. And she continues to complain about the pressure in her head. And he says, with great hesitation and resignation, following these suggestions that I just said, that sounds really hard. That's what he says. And you could see there's a look on his face like, what am I doing here? And please keep this intervention, this technique in mind. I'm going to return to this in a moment, okay? But the technique is, that sounds really hard, okay? The main point is, when you're with a person like this, you have to be aware that if you try to, and I quote, suggest something to the covert narcissist, there's a very good chance you're going to come under attack. And what you said, despite its intent to be helpful, will be reversed. And before you know it, you will be accused of hurting them. And that was that example I gave in episode 1 of the couple that I was treating. But here's another example. If someone constantly keeps you waiting, right? And eventually you point this out by just inquiring, is everything okay? Or did something hold you up? What you may hear is something like, you're making me feel like a terrible person just for being a few minutes late. Or why are you always so obsessed about the time? Or you're always criticizing me. Even though you weren't trying to start something, this is a very common reaction that you'll get. But you may now be asking, why do they do this? Why do they respond in this way? If you keep in mind, borrowing from the theory that I outlined in part 1, what I just reviewed briefly, what is the main goal of the covert narcissist? The main goal is to achieve the bliss and contentment characteristic of that early stage of development when emotional resonance, all the things I mentioned in the prior episode, affective attunement, right, containing, all of this went missing. So that intense bond with an early caregiver was missing, or it was ruptured prematurely at a point where you were not yet able to process this kind of rupture. And what this implies is then the reunion that I mentioned is the reunion of the grandiose self, right? That I cry and somebody understands me, or I complain and somebody gets it. So the reunion of the grandiose self with another person who must always be there. This is the all nourishing, giving, loving, caring person that what went missing earlier in life. So this is what goes missing. So if something's missing, these individuals are constantly looking for this in their adult relationships. Remember, according to the theory, the blissful union is ruptured too quickly and therefore becomes the central focus of the covert narcissist adult life. That's the main point. And I hope that part I made clear, because we're going to build on this in terms of then, how do you relate to somebody like this? Can you develop a relationship? What sort of hope does this relationship have? If you keep in mind that the golden fantasy is based now on a demand to be loved and gratified totally with no requirement to do anything in return, when you make a recommendation or you try to help her think about her own actions, in the case of the wife, labeling and pathologizing her husband's behavior, she hears only one thing: you don't love me, you don't care for, or you don't care about me. When you question something, right? So when you suggest something, when you make a recommendation, or when you question something, you are breaking this union, and that can potentially be re-traumatizing. This is the early rupture relived, right? This is that early trauma, right? This is the rupture that I keep describing. Or if you listen to my soon to be released continuing an education seminar, yes, I just recorded a continuing education seminar on effective techniques for addressing personality disorders in challenging patients. It's a little bit more clinical, but I go into a lot more detail there into something that we called a reenactment. I'm quoting this, a reenactment. So something from early childhood gets repeated. It gets what we call reenacted. For these individuals, for the covert narcissist, the world becomes their caregiver, and they want one thing and one thing only. What is that? What do they want? They want for you to give them what went missing. I know it does not come out that way. On the surface, you only see them suffering. Remember that they frequently play the role of victim. Or you only see the frustration, or you only feel guilty because they've reversed the situation and they made you completely at fault for asking a question, for just trying to talk to them. Their longings are hidden because it is humiliating to need something. And that's why you're not going to see that. By the way, just as a very quick digression, it is humiliating for any type of narcissist. It is always humiliating to have a need and to depend on somebody. So it is humiliating and you won't see it, but instead you'll get caught up in this argument about the way that you treated them because you broke that bond by asking a question. And in terms of relating to them, knowing now this is something that you could believe, right? If you subscribe to this theory, all of this now becomes grist for the mill. All of this becomes part of the relationship, right? For me, I was going to say treatment. It all becomes part of the treatment when I work with these individuals. I'm always thinking about therapy because in therapy, the therapeutic technique is to attempt to understand their inner world. And that's what I'm suggesting that you do as well. If you're in this kind of relationship, the goal is to understand their inner world and give this back to them in an empathic way, not to use it as a weapon, but to understand it and then be more empathic, to detoxify it. That's what we call it in my field, the field of psychoanalysis. So let me give you an example of this with this couple. Slowly, I began to show this woman that when I asked her a question about the way she was labeling her husband's behavior as pathological, she was absolutely convinced that I am not interested in understanding her, that I didn't care about her. I didn't care about her feelings. That's what I meant by grist for the mill. Slowly, we bring this into the relationship. The goal is, and I quote, validating her experience without, and I quote, gratifying her needs. So there's a big difference. You could validate somebody without gratifying them. Let me give the example. Remember the film I just referenced a moment ago, and I said that he says to her with great hesitation and resignation, that's to the woman with the nail in her head, that when she was complaining about the pressure in her head, that it was not about the nail, he said, and I quote, "That sounds really hard." What I'm suggesting to you is this is an intervention that I guess may be a little bit helpful, but remember the look on his face that I said, because it's kind of like he knew that telling somebody that that sounds really hard, this will not work. And please, I hope you can hear this, because so many of us get caught in the trap of what we think is validating their feelings. Giving her what she's asking for will only keep her stuck in the same maladaptive pattern of craving constant what? Validation and attention. See, when you say this sounds really hard, this is part of the problem. You're sort of feeding into it, if that makes sense. And then things will never change. Instead, around the fight with her husband, that clinical example that I gave, I would ask for clarification. So, do I understand this correctly? You see your husband as overly aggressive and caring nothing about you or your feelings, like something like that, right? And when I asked you if you thought that labeling him or calling him names had an impact on him, you then perceived me as another person who was criticizing or not understanding you. So you see what I'm doing here? The first thing I did was I seek clarification. Do I understand this correctly? Right? And if I sense that she's listening and open to hearing a little bit more, which I did sense, by the way, I can then label. I don't mean pathologize. So let me be clear with that. It's not the kind of labeling that she was doing with her husband. What I'm labeling is the longing for agreement. See, that's the blissful union. She's longing for agreement and her wish that her husband would just give her what she needs, or that I would not ask any questions or make any observations of her behavior, that we should both always be there for her without her ever expressing a need or a longing. She doesn't need to do any of that. We should know, right? So this is the grist for the mill. This is what begins to make its way into the relationship. And this is what helped her feel seen and understood. Why? Why? What's so different about this? Because I was holding the goodness of her underlying vulnerable sense. I'm not attacking her. I am not getting frustrated with her. I don't feel guilty. I don't play any of that. I don't just say, oh, this sounds like it's really hard. Okay? But now you may be saying, these people are very aggressive, right? That was the wife's initial complaint about her husband as well. What about the aggression? How do you work with the aggression? Yes, of course I was able to see her toxic aggression. I knew it was there, but at this point in the treatment, or I would say to you, at this point in your relationship, it would not be appropriate to talk about that. Why? Because if you talk to your partner who you think is suffering with these covert narcissistic characteristics, how will they end up feeling? You think they're going to say, yes, you're right. I was aggressive. I am sorry. No, they're going to feel judged and criticized and blamed, right? And that is going to reinforce the victim role, which they love, right? Because now you are victimizing them. Remember that? And then they do the reversal and they're going to say, look what you're doing to me. So instead, I would focus on how she felt perpetually wronged and mistreated by others. Just to reiterate, at this point in your relationship, the main goal is to be active, ask for greater or more details and specific examples from your partner. Yes, this is just the opposite of the recommendations I detailed a little bit earlier at the beginning of this episode and in more detail in the prior episode. In my experience, putting up a boundary, getting distance is not the solution. It's just the opposite. With the covert narcissistic patient, I am constantly searching out and attempting to organize in their mind how they see me and everyone in their life as out to do something to them. See that? I don't know if you picked up on it. That's why I wanted to label this very, very clearly, is I'm beginning to show them how they think about me or other people in their life. Okay. This is sort of like the beginning level tools and techniques at this point in your relationship. Much later, a more advanced tool for those of you who have been listening and you've done this technique, a more advanced tool is to help this person see and appreciate how someone who always feels that nobody cares about them may want to control the interaction with that person or with other people in their life out of fear that if they were not in control, what would happen? What if they're not in control? They would be mistreated by the other person. See, now you're doing a light touch on the anger, because remember, that was the question. What about the anger? How do you deal with it? The way that we deal with it is very slowly and a light touch by showing them, in other words, by controlling the interaction with what? Her accusations, and not allowing for another opinion or perspective to be expressed. Someone's not even free to ask a question. Why were you running late for dinner, right? All of this supports the belief that nobody really cares. This approach, I have found, oftentimes leads to an expanded capacity to think in terms of mental states, right? Meaning what? It enables your partner, who may have these covert narcissistic characteristics, to recognize that their relationships are shaped in large part by their own perception, right? Their own mental models of others. So, in other words, there's a certain way, I'm trying to say this differently, there's a certain way they chronically see you as someone who's out to do what? Criticize, hurt, judge, etc., right? And that's what we're beginning to show them at this early point, okay? And believe me, there are many other tools and techniques we could use, but they're a little more advanced, and we have to start wrapping things up now. And while I appreciate that there is still much more to say, at the very least, we were able to explore covert narcissism, highlight its defining traits such as hypersensitivity to criticism, emotional manipulation, victim mentality, intense neediness, and grandiose fantasies. By employing psychodynamic theories like Margaret Mahler's separation individuation theory, right? We've gained insights into the origins of these behaviors and the deep-seated need for what? Emotional reunion and validation. So that means, again, anytime you question something or make an observation or give a suggestion, you break that magical union with them. And that's a re-traumatization. Practical strategies for relationships, like for building relationships, were discussed, emphasizing the importance of appreciating the need for the magical union. Through clinical examples, we have seen the application of these insights underlying the need to validate but not gratify your partner's need for what? control or sympathy, right? Because remember what I said before, that only plays into this maladaptive solution that they've come up with, that everybody should be there for them. Anyway, I encourage you to reach out with any questions or comments regarding these really complicated processes. This topic is undeniably complex. And if there's anything I discussed that requires further clarification, please do not hesitate to send me an email. Additionally, I have supporting resources available, including a soon-to-be-released continuing education seminar and videos on covert narcissism. These resources can be accessed through my website, which is linked below. All right, I think we got through it. We got as far as we could get. And again, please feel free to reach out. But until next time, engage your mind and continue exploring the depths of psychodynamic theory and techniques to improve your relationships. All right, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.